So good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome to the panel paper presentation on teacher education is site of challenging whiteness and inequality. My name is Grisel Robles Schrader, she, ella pronouns. We're excited to have 3 presentations during this session, and I want to thank the authors for their time and their effort working on each of these scholarly areas and sharing those findings with us during today's sessions. Participants, thank you so much for joining. We look forward to hearing from you during the Q&A portion, and I encourage you to jot down some questions during each of the presentations. So before I pass the mic, I just want to give a quick overview of the session agenda. I'm going to announce the presenter, they'll introduce themselves, where they're from, and their topic, and just jump right in. Each presentation is about 20 minutes long. Rosetta is going to give a 5-minute warning by reappearing via video. And then after the last presenter is done, we'll open it up for Q&A, which will be about like 25 minutes or so. Just double checking. All right, great. So please share your name, your title, and your organization in the chat so we get to know who's here today. In the meantime, I want to pass the mic over to Tim Peterson and Amanda Kidwell, who are going to kick us off today. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. We are really excited to be here. My name is Tim Peterson. I'm the Director of Assessment for the Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin. Amanda?
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Kidwell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am currently a Director of Student Success for Wayland Academy and Director of a consulting group called Collidal Solutions. Tim and I were co-workers for many years at Madison Schools, and we developed this guidance, and we are very much looking forward to sharing this with you today.
So I think, did you want to move on from there, or do you want to go ahead?
Yep, just please put yourself in the chat. We'd like to know who we have in the room with us today, so we can make sure we're thinking about our context as we are sharing our information.
So I'll begin by just kind of setting the stage of where we're from, what why we're here today, and what we're sharing with you. So the Madison Metropolitan School District is in the state of Wisconsin. We are in north central portion of the United States. The city itself is the capital of the state of Wisconsin. It's in the southern half of the state. So we are the site of state, city, and county government. We also have a major research university in our backyard. In fact, if I were to look out the window, I could see the Cole Center, which is where the UW Badgers play basketball, literally right across the street. So we're surrounded by government and surrounded by academe. And so it's a very interesting place to be. I also want to acknowledge that our city and our district sit in land that was stolen from the whole chunk nation through broken promises and through force. So as a district, we're committed to improving educational outcomes for not only our Indigenous youth, but also our Black, Latinx students and students of color. So I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that. The picture on the right is it shows you what the district looks like. And one of the unusual things about Madison, if you've never been here, is that we literally built around lakes. The Capitol building itself is centered on what it was finally known as the isthmus. So if you've never been on an isthmus, it's a body of land, a strip of land surrounded by water on each side. So the district itself, if you look at it, it's almost divides itself into 2 parts. So we have an north and east, and we have a south and west. And so the district itself plays out like that in many respects. One of the things that our situation provides, and Amanda will attest to this, is that because we have state and local government, and we have the state legislature sitting in session in our backyard within our district, it provides a lot of opportunities for scrutiny. And so That typically comes from the media, from the state legislators. They look at us often. We have the State Department of Public Instruction, which is our state education department, sits in our backyard, and many of our staff members move to that particular organization at times. And then also surrounding districts look to us because we are the second largest district in the state. They look to us for practical guidance. They don't ask us, but they say, well, so what is Madison doing? Because we have, given the size of the district, we have some of the resources that the much smaller school districts in the state of Wisconsin do not have. Wisconsin has approximately 425 districts at 27,000 students. While many of you would recognize that as not incredibly large, it is the second largest district in the state, Milwaukee Public Schools being the largest. Demographically, we're broken up into groups that there really is no majority. That has changed pretty dramatically over the last decade. And so we're making some shifts, some changes in that. We have 52 schools, 4 comprehensive high schools, and all the kinds of joy that comes along with that. So Amanda, you want to move ahead? So one of the things that I would like to share is not only the demographics, but also some of the service provision categories that our students we would recognize. So in our with low income, you can see that we have approximately 1 out of every 2 students is low income. Our English language learners, 1 out of every 4 students. So every 4th student in the district is an English learner. A lot of that comes from the university in our backyard because they attract families and scholars from all over the world. We end up with having over 100 languages spoken within the district. One of our elementary schools has 70 languages alone, and so providing some interest and some challenges. Next slide, please. So the process of how we got to what we're actually going to be talking about today is that we have an assessment team that meets on a regular basis. It's a small team, and you can see the makeup of that team, but the purpose of that is to provide guidance to the rest of the district. What are we guiding? Well, we're trying to ensure that with respect to current diagnostic assessments, that for students who learn SLD determination, that it's actually legally defensible, it's doing right by students in all ends, all nature of the students who come to us. So you see actually a list of what's an approved list of assessments that this committee goes through, and we have about 10 or 12 different lists based on the type of assessment. So we look at what is the assessment, who is it appropriate for, what's it appropriate for, who can give the assessment. And one of the things that we have added recently is what are the norms that are available. And so we'll get to our conversation about that in a moment. Part of what this committee does is we troubleshoot any issues that come up. And so, Amanda, if you could go to the next slide. One of the things that we did was we had a question raised, and it appeared to be fairly straightforward until we actually got into it. What set of norms should be used for students who do not identify as either male or female? Specifically, we're talking about speech and language assessments, but it could be for any. So which set of norms should be used for students who are transgender, gender diverse? And it seemed like, well, somebody should have answered this already, but they didn't. And so what we did is we worked to create guidance that addresses some of this. So the kind of the intersection of issues that came up is, first of all, we are legally, morally, and ethically obligated to do the best by students, and as we use diagnostic assessments for special education evaluations. And that means also that we look at each student and we acknowledge who they are, and ensure that we come in from a positive perspective on who that student is and not from a deficit perspective. We have to make sure that the norms that we do use to do that are fair and valid. And here is something that as we dug into this, we discovered every 2 years, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction does a youth risk behavior survey from students from all grades, typically from grade 6 and above. We had the survey that identified that students anonymously identified themselves as transgender. We had almost 2% of all students who took this. This is in the state, while 1.6 were not sure of their gender identity, which led to some interesting things. We also know that from research in pediatrics that nearly 3% of all students identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. And so this becomes an issue. So if we look at the number of students in Madison Metropolitan School District, 27,000, how many students actually fall into this category? We're talking, roughly over 750 students. And so it was really critical that we actually get into this and figure out what's going on. Our county does a youth risk assessment as well, and that is done every 3 years. So the number of students who identified as transgender in these grades, 3.7%. And so this really led us to look at and think about the approaches to assessment, evaluation, and the use of norms to help support students as they become identified or not. So Amanda, I think if you want to jump in and you can either finish this slide or
Yeah.
So Amanda, I have to tell you, is a bilingual psychologist, school psychologist. So that's her background, whereas I am a lowly high school science teacher. So she has more background than I do on this. So go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. And not lowly at all. You have led our assessment work in Madison for years and have done an incredible job of that. So yeah, Tim and I have partnered around evaluation and assessment as I was an assistant director in student services the last several years in Madison schools before transitioning to a new role this school year. And this question came up of how do we really be responsive to our youth? Madison Metropolitan School District in general has been fairly progressive in terms of identifying and supporting student gender identity, as well as incorporating the Welcoming Schools curriculum that recognizes LGBTQ+ families and identities in our buildings. And so with this opportunity that came up, we offered to form a multidisciplinary team and sent that out to our school psychologists, what we call program support teachers, who act like lead special ed teachers and lead initial evaluations for special education in our school district, speech and language pathologists, our lead occupational therapist, and Tim, as our data evaluation specialist and director of assessment, was also a part of that group as well. And we had several focused meetings where we did some behind the scenes work to prep and then pulled this big team together to look at existing research, identify what were the key messages and information based on what we knew from research, as well as what our own district guidance was around supporting trans and gender expansive youth, and then really creating a short, simple guidance document for our different practitioners within special ed when they are doing that diagnostic assessment. And so we're going to take a look in just a moment at the actual guidance document and really kind of go through what those pieces are and some of the highlights. But we really determined that the key components were the first kind of 5 layers in this funnel here, but that we really needed to have a rationale and explain what the purpose was for this guidance, really making sure we touch on the key assessment practices that we want to have in place for all students for any evaluation. And then we got specific and created guidance for students who are transgender, as well as guidance for students who are non-binary or gender diverse or gender expansive. A quick note around language, as our time goes so quickly. We use the terms both non-binary as well as gender expansive or gender diverse, and recognizing that language is a socially and culturally held ideals around how we name things. And at this moment in time, trying to be the most broad and respectful of different student identities, we landed on the gender diverse and gender expansive as being the widest umbrella to recognize some students may be non-binary, some may be more gender fluid, or use other terms to signify that they do not identify as one specific gender all the time in their identity. And so the final pieces around our guidance document then had references and resources. And we're at the point where we're ready for training and communication, and we will share in just a moment kind of what that's looking like.
However, I just need to jump in and say the district is also embroiled in a lawsuit around these kinds of issues, with families bringing interest a suit. And so we haven't gotten as far as we want to with this whole process. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll share that a little more as well in just a moment. So again, we'll look at the actual guidance, but it really came down to these specific kind of key pieces that we wanted to communicate with staff. And again, really basing that on research from a variety of backgrounds. The first thing when it's doing any evaluation with a student, that you are establishing rapport. And that during that time, you are using that conversation and you're getting to know a student, where you are discussing your pronouns and talking to the student about what pronouns they use and what their gender identity may look like. If it turns out, or the student reveals in the conversation, that they are transgender or are gender diverse, having a discussion with students around what has been shared with their families, how are they referred to at school, how do they want to be referred to in a formal report, and how that should be communicated. That is something that can be done with students really all ages, in terms of saying, how are you, referred to? I talk with every student I ever meet with and do assessment with, and say, how do you want me to refer to you in this report? What name do you use, or what nickname would you like? And then I can always use a full name and then add a sentence around how they're referred to. We also really determined that using combined norms when available for these diagnostic assessments was key and best practice in general. Most assessments, thinking about intellectual assessment, academic achievement assessment, some of the social emotional rating scales often have combined norms, meaning gender is not a piece that you have to piece apart when you're looking at student information. However, there are assessments where you are asked to select either male or female as a gender option when completing norms to rate a student or to get that data from an evaluation. So we really encourage our staff to really look at using combined norms when available. The guidance for students who are transgender focuses on we should be using the norms that match the gender identity of the student, particularly if this is something that the student is then sharing widely and knows that the information from the evaluation will be communicated, that we are then sharing that information and putting it in the report and reflecting their identity. And so if a student is assigned male at birth and identifies as female and is transgender, uses she, her pronouns, has her name, then the norms that should be used for that assessment would be the female norms to best reflect that student's gender identity. For students who are gender non-binary or gender expansive, so again, trying to focus on that use of combined norms, but if that's not possible, if you have to use certain assessments, you again have to choose based on gender to get those scores. We're really encouraging our practitioners to use norms for both male and female students and looking at and doing the analysis twice. So looking at, if I run it as under the male norms and the female norms, does it say similar information? More often than not in assessments, there's not a huge variance by gender based on the data, but taking that into account. And if the data is conflicting based on the two norms, then using additional information to really build out and have a better understanding of concern. So if I complete a formal assessment with the student, I get norms for both female and male students to compare them to, and find that potentially one is more stating that the student is at risk or their skills are at level of concern. And I also really want to be doing those classroom observations, parent, teacher, student interviews around the skills that we're trying to address, and then potentially using other formal measures if possible to get the best picture of data, and really kind of having, again, that we take lots of pieces, putting all of the pieces together before we make decisions around students and what is best within their educational settings. So again, we know we collect that data to really focus on students, right? It's their success and the progress that we want to see overall. And I think oftentimes when I've worked with staff, and we might get really caught in the detail of exactly what do I do and tell me the right answer in this situation, is I always go back to our purpose. And purpose is that it's kids at the center, that it's all about students, that it is about their success and progress, and what information helps us get there. So the actual guidance document itself, I've written way too many guidance documents over the years as someone who's worked in a large district and helped lead pieces. So I try to keep them short and sweet as possible, knowing if it's too long, it won't get read. The TLDR, right? Too long didn't read. I try to keep it so that it exists as a TLDR, just keeping it short. And again, you can see we state rationale. We do link to our MMSD guidance and policy around supporting students who are transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive. Again, when we talk about our roadmap in just a minute, we'll talk about where we are kind of caught on the side of the road, I think, right now, with a tire needing to be repaired in our general guidance in Madison. And then here's where we talk about that assessment guidance, linking to the document Tim shared with you, or one of them, the approved assessment lists. We've worked really hard as a district to identify which assessments we believe are fair, valid, and culturally normed to best represent our students. And then we have the specific language, and we really did keep it short and sweet, brief statements and examples around how to best complete evaluations. Again, really thinking about that special education or section 504 evals, and how we can best use the data and information in a way that supports and lifts our student identity. And so in general, that is the majority of the guidance really comes down to those few paragraphs. And then we did link to all of the resources, the primary resources that were used to develop this guidance document, so staff can also choose to learn more if they need to, and that we are fortunate in that we have leads in all of our special education areas with individuals who partner with our central office and have opportunities, again, to participate in determining guidance, as well as supporting the rollout and enactment of that guidance. And I know our time is going. So where we are now, so we identified the need, we developed guidance, working on training and communication for rollout when last year Madison Schools was hit with a lawsuit by a lawyer group that focuses on family rights around a piece of our transgender student guidance that talks about how student confidentiality is key, and that we do not always have to immediately disclose to families if a student shares with school staff about their gender identity. And that is currently what the aspect that is being challenged in court. And so we are on hold with implementation of our guidance. We still have some things in place. We still do all of our welcoming schools guidance and really focus on supporting our students. Knowing that this is something in the works, we have had to hold back on our training and communication for rollout. The upside is we get to share this still with all of you today. So really focusing on that piece of sharing ideas and feedback. Love to gain any of your feedback. This is something we will continue to revisit as it is rolled out with staff. We hope eventually, once that is all settled, and then we do that piece of continued refinement and adjustment. I think we are right at our 20 minutes. You know, we will do questions and connections at the end. We also have our emails here on the slide if you want to connect with us more personally. You can also use the Whova app. Both Tim and I can be found through there as a way to connect and send messages as well. And we'll have some time for questions at the end today. Thank you all.
First of all, thank you so much. So please, round of applause to Tim and Amanda, real and virtual. Thank you so much. So we are in luck. You are in luck. We have our next two presenters that have not shown. So Rosetta, just unmute yourself if they end up popping up. In the meantime, I want to take full advantage that we can have a Q&A session that starts now. And so I think that to make it a little bit more engaged, if folks can mimic what Michael has done, which is if you feel comfortable, please share your video of yourself just to create a more engaging space in this virtual world that we're living in right now. And feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat box. You can send a message to me privately or to Rosetta privately if you don't feel like you want to share it with the the entire group. I also invite you to share your name, your title, your org, and what city you're from. I see we got Chicago represented, we got Boston, the state of Arizona, and then somebody didn't write their city or state, so I apologize. So please add it in the chat. The whole idea is that we have a conversation. A couple final things. Please no follow-up questions so that you can give somebody else a turn in this space. But as was mentioned earlier, we've got the HOVA app, so take full advantage if you can't squeeze in 2 questions during this time. And yes, please reach out to our presenters. Thank you so much, Amanda and Tim. I think a couple things I just want to highlight as somebody who worked on HIV/AIDS testing and linkage to care for quite some time. This issue of healthcare providers not being culturally responsive to our LGBTQ population of young people 12 to 24 was such a prevalent issue. And I'm talking about back in 2004 to 2010. And so it's just really helpful to see you all step into this space to create the guidance that you felt needed to be made. I think it's really critical. I also think it's very critical for us to talk about terminology. It's always changing. And we recognize that as long as people are being respectful, you open the doorway for a continued conversation, but it's always helpful to learn new terms. And I think the last piece I just wanted to say is thanks for sharing the reality that this does get into spaces that we don't always intend, which is, you know, lawsuits and whatnot. Young people tend to be the least privileged in every culture. Because they are not in a position of power to control and make decisions for themselves. And so just knowing that the 2 of you are in this space as leaders, I think just helps to create the space for continued dialogue when we need support or recognizing that we're not always going to get the support from our communities. So I just wanted to point out just a few things that I thought really stood out. And so with that, let me take a step back and open up the space to the group. Please unmute yourself or use the chat.
Hi, I'm Michael. I prefer he or they pronouns, and wanted to thank you for giving such a great overview of sort of the problem at hand and how you were starting to address it and some of the challenges you're facing now. I also noticed and really appreciated the way that you expanded terminology around transgender, gender diverse, non-binary. And I'm wondering if that came from the students, where the decision to expand that language came from.
Oh, thank you, Michael, for your question. And as I understand, at least, yes, partially that has come from our students. So again, Madison, since the 90s, truly has really led in including LGBTQ+ issues in schools and really working directly with students and families and thinking about what it means to be welcoming and supportive of students in MMSD. Cherie Hose deserves all the shout outs in the world. She is our LGBTQ+ programming lead in Madison, and she is incredible and has got an amazing board of students at middle school and high school level that help inform guidance policies, provide feedback on their experiences in schools, from everything related to belongingness or feelings of bullying or isolation, how they feel that their identities and who they are represented in schools. And so Cherie did a lot of work in initially developing that guidance document that's now being challenged in court, and really did work with students. And it kind of was many conversations around how do you try to figure out what the right words are when language is a constant, ever-flowing change, right? Based on, again, where we are currently. And then something I tell students that I teach now, that, you know, in 10 years, the words we use today will no longer be the words that we use, because language should continue to evolve. And so I think the discussions really were, how do we best represent the plethora of ways that students are identifying their gender identity right now, and really wanting to signify that we weren't excluding or trying to lose anyone in that process. So it really was partially driven by students, a lot of listening and looking online and through other resources, through our community, and where are people in talking about gender identity and making sure we can best represent that in our current guidance. Go ahead, Tim.
And yes, I was just going to say, and it does play out in a multitude of ways across the district. It has been and continues to be a journey. I just have to tell you that CREA is on sabbatical this semester, and so she will be back in the spring. So we're missing her greatly. Also, I mean, just one of the things that, I mean, how this spins off into some more technical things. I'm the director of assessment. It is critically important to us that we ensure that any names are actually correct. And so we're working with the state in the state databases to ensure that students who have changed their name, who've gone through transitions as a natural age, for instance, from middle school to high school, suddenly having their dead name be used again, we absolutely want to avoid that. And we work really hard to ensure that not only does that happen in the district, but also happens at the state level.
Thank you for your question, Michael. I invite others to unmute themselves or share a question in the chat box, either privately to myself or Rosetta or with the group.
Is there a way to access the guidance doc mentioned? And Tim, you and I should probably, I'm fine sharing it, but I helped write it. So it's in, I don't work at MMSD anymore. So I'm like, share it with the world. But Tim, what do you think?
Thanks. Yeah, it puts us in a really tricky spot because of this lawsuit. I mean, to let you know how intense it was, our opening comment from our legal department this year to principals was, we're under injunction not to lie to families. I mean, that's how serious this is. Quite honestly, I have no problem sharing it as long as you don't call up our superintendent or our legal department. You're more than welcome to use it because there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. Take it, use it, and use it for the best interest of all our kids.
The other thing, I guess, since I don't see too many questions, and I'll pause in a moment too, if there's other verbal questions, to know, to me, the other piece of this that goes hand in hand, just besides saying like, go use combined norms, is that at other conferences when they are in person. I had one over the summer where I was able to connect with test publishers very specifically and say, how are you looking at gender identity when you are collecting new norm information? And is that something that you are taking into consideration when you're looking at the validity and reliability of your assessments? You know, most of them just look panicked when I ask that because I don't know that that has been considered a whole lot yet. I also remember that look of panic about 10 years ago when I started as a bilingual school psychologist and asking the same thing around, what are you doing for Spanish norms? What are you doing for Spanish speaking students who are in bilingual programs or English only? How are you collecting that info? And that is something I've seen a ton of progress in testing companies in the last decade or so really working to address. So I hope the more we can all say that this is important information to consider and gather, the more that those test companies listen and include that in their information.
And thank you for sharing that link in the chat. I would also encourage folks to engage in community engagement strategies, because obviously, you know, we don't want to assume that something that works in one location will work in another. And so by drawing in support from community stakeholders, regardless of what sector they represent, you can garner more information. You'll probably end up tweaking things. It will, you know, allow you to continue a dialogue with Amanda and Tim, you know, about some of the tweaks, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I would in support of that, Madison has been having this conversation, as Amanda said, for decades. It is not unheard of. It is not, while some portions of the community may be offended, it is part of the norm in how we do business. So yes, your community may not be the same, and so you have to take different approaches.
I have a question. It's more personal, but I imagine others have the same challenge. My kids have, well, a non-binary friend and a gender transitioning friend at our high school. And I want to know what's an easy way to learn to use the proper pronouns?
Practice. You practice and you practice and you practice and you reflect. And when you catch yourself making the wrong pronoun or saying the wrong thing,
You never want to do that, but yeah,
it
practice.
happens. I mean, I accidentally used the wrong pronouns when referring to my friends who are cisgendered, people who are the gender that they were assigned at birth on accident anyway. Or the more you practice, the easier it gets. And when I do notice I've made an error, I fix it as quick as I can and move forward. And if I notice or pay attention to if the person I'm referring to is there, I try to pull them aside and say sorry. I don't stop and say sorry in front of everyone because sometimes that's worse, right? If the and now it's a big deal. And if you notice that there might be upset, half a minute later to say, hey, I noticed I did that. I'm sorry, it wasn't my intent. I'm going to keep working on it. But generally, I have found the more you practice, the easier it gets. There's some really great YouTube videos about how do you get used to using they, them pronouns. And so about how do you practice, right? Using they and themselves and using that in lots of different contexts. And to me, it's really about leading with grace. And again, you practice, try to be aware, and you ask for forgiveness when you need to, and just keep moving forward. That's a good question, and it comes up a lot.
And part of the Welcoming Schools professional development that we do, we actually practice. And so to have that in a safe space where I can make a mistake and knowing that the person who's receiving this is accepting of it, it's good. I just a quick share an exercise that we've done. We were asked to pull out our phones and a picture of someone or something that is important to us, and then share with a partner describing your relationship with that person without using pronouns, period. And so that drives home how much we depend on that, but that there are so many other ways of actually describing relationships, the person that is in the photo, for instance, or the pet that is in the photo, and your personal relationship with them. So I'm just an example of something that practice, as Amanda said, is so important.
Hi. Great ideas. Fiona?
Hi, I just want to thank you all for doing this important work. I work for a company, an international organization, and the work that we're doing, I work for CREA, and we provide both improvement services as well as assessment. And this conversation is coming up from state departments and from school districts. And we are, what I really appreciate that you said is that we need to listen to the community, and we need to find out what the needs are and what the needs specifically of our LGBTQ community, what their feedback is, and supporting those conversations. I think that we've had a lot of this conversation at the state and district level. We have yet to engage with the community. So I so appreciate the direction and guidance to support listening and engaging and finding out about the experiences as well as what the current needs are. And I did ask the question about the document because I wanted the opportunity just to see how this is being framed, and so that as we engage in dialogue and the requests, because we create surveys, we have surveys and we have student surveys, as well as, of course, our assessments, and state departments want to be able to disaggregate according to gender, and we're not supporting gender expansiveness at all, because we still have two specific genders, which exclude so many students. And so I just really appreciate this work and this conversation and the support to be courageous to move this forward.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I appreciate that. And agree, it is absolutely critical. And I think the other piece in this conversation is, and I don't know, because we don't have many norms that are accurately representative of students who are trans or gender expansive, but as a psychologist, right, I know how at risk our LGBTQ youth are for everything from mental health to homelessness to experiencing violence to all kinds of things. And I don't know if that would show up differently in our academic or in our other assessments that we currently use, because we've never been looked. And so I just wonder often of, are we doing the best we can by all of our students when we often don't even know if we're like if we can't be targeted or focused in that and looking at the data and through that lens. So I appreciate that comment and your feedback.
And I would just say that it was mentioned before, but I can't emphasize it enough that we as a community need to continue to press on our vendors to remove just the binary choices. It's slow, but it's happening. So we're actually seeing some movement in vendors. I mean, I raise the question all the time with them and even say, and tell me why we need this. Just as flat out as that. But continue to have the conversation as they listen when suddenly they've heard the same thing multiple times. It's interesting.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things that I would also like to encourage us to do is, you know, in our marginalized communities across the country, we often focus on things like that are tragic and that are specific to our struggle. For example, homelessness and suicide rates, et cetera. I think it's also important for us to highlight those great and amazing things that these students are doing. The activism, the support, the talent and skills and knowledge, you know, those are the things we don't hear about as much. You know, we hear about all the other statistics. And so I also wonder, how do we highlight and leverage the strengths and the incredible things that our children are doing and that our students are doing to support visibility in a positive way?
I can jump in if you don't mind. Community engagement is my jam. So one reason I think community stakeholder engagement is so critical is for what we're talking about, like especially when we have underrepresented, marginalized, underserved communities. When we get pushback, we can say like, no, these are all the people who we're working alongside, not on behalf of, but alongside, who need this, want this, and have informed this process, right? So that strengthens the things that we're doing. On the flip side, what you're talking about is asset-based community development. I'll toss a link. DePaul University has an institute, and it forces us to think about moving from a deficit-based approach to an asset-based approach. Communities have many different assets, and people bring gifts, and if that's too woo-woo, skills that they want to share and use in order to identify what changes are needed and to implement what changes are needed. It forces us, though, who represents academia, government institutions, and other organizations to really rethink our role, because it centers communities and community residents to be the lead on prioritization of whatever needs to happen and the implementation of that piece. And so I'm glad that we're talking about this piece, because it's, again, especially thinking about this particular community, they need to be at the forefront. Young people need to be at the forefront. I want to make sure I'm using the right term. Gender expansive young people need to be at the forefront of this. And so I'd be curious to see in the lawsuit, you know, are they being asked about their opinions about what their needs are, and you know, what they think about all of this? As it really struck me, Amanda, when you had mentioned we have to ask them what their gender, their pronouns are, but then also contextualize what are their pronouns at home and at school. It's so powerful. The fact that someone's challenging this set of norms is just really, really interesting.
My wife is a civil rights lawyer, and she likes to say, if you're not being sued about it, you're not doing the right equity work, because it's going to go to court eventually. So that was when we found out that last year, I believe, right, Tim, that we found out that there was an injunction. I was so frustrated, and I didn't even lead. I was part of the work in terms of our major guidance. This work I helped lead, but it was hard. She's like, well, if you're not being sued about it, it's not the right work, because that is how equity work, right? And I think about disability, access to education, literally everything has had to go through the courts in order for rights to be secured. So we will hold on and continue to listen to our communities.
And continue to push forward, listening to our students.
Thank you, Grisel, for sharing that link to DePaul's community asset research. I'm excited to read that. Any other comments, questions, feedback on what you did see? Again, knowing that this is something we've not been able to roll out the way we wanted, any feedback is welcomed. As again, we really want to focus on making sure this is the most useful that it can be for staff.
I guess I have one question. It's not a very specific one, but I was wondering if you could share some of your insights about sources of support or positive response that you weren't necessarily anticipating, but have helped either bolster your work or facilitate it. I think sometimes it's nice to hear also about how we identify strengths and support in doing this work.
Yeah, I can speak to somewhat of what we said, that Madison is well known for being a city in space that has been long welcoming for LGBTQ individuals, so it doesn't mean it is not without its challenges or moments of hate or violence as well. It is like any other community. However, our previous superintendent in Madison was very supportive of making systemic change to be more supportive of our students who are LGBTQ, and really helped to lift that into being a full-time position in our district, that we have someone who focuses their entire job around supporting our LGBTQ youth in our schools, as well as then I think we had a half-time person as well for a little while to help really roll out and create this guidance. So we had a lot of administrative support. We have a lot of community support. 2 of our school board members are members of the LGBTQ plus family. And so we're again very vocal, and we have a very vocal community in that they want their children to feel seen and safe in all ways at school. And so we've been very fortunate to have that kind of community support. There's always a lot of discussions and events and connection between community, school board members, and our schools. And so we do have a lot of really helpful factors for us in being able to do the work. Trevor Project has a main office here in Madison. We have major galas and award ceremonies around work in schools for the entire Midwest every year occur here in Madison. And so again, there's just a lot of natural support in the area as well, and resources that we can connect with.
Thanks for sharing.
So in many respects, we're very fortunate. We appreciate it, and we understand that as well. Well, I know for one would say, if you do have any comments or questions or ideas to say, hey, you might want to think about this, please share it with us, as we're always looking for ways to improve. And we would be happy to share resources with anyone who's interested. I appreciate your time and being here.
Yes.
One final round of applause. Thank you so much, Amanda and Tim. We appreciate you and the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody. You get 10 minutes of your time back.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.